The transit alarm screamed for exactly 2 seconds before Sierra Marin killed it with her thumb. She was already standing, already braced against the navigation console, already watching the forward display peel back the white static of hyperspace into something real. Stars resolved first too many, too bright, packed into a cluster so dense it looked like the inside of a furnace. Then the gas clouds came in, violet and copper and threaded with radiation signatures that made the sensor officer curse under his breath. They had arrived in the Vithani threshold. And they were not alone. "Contact," Lieutenant Harsk said from the sensor pit, his voice stripped of everything except the fact. "Multiple returns, bearing 015 through 048 range. Commander, range is 11,000 kilometers. They're close." Too close. Sierra felt the number settle in her chest like a stone. 11,000 kilometers was handshake distance in fleet terms. It meant the Vithani had known exactly where the Terran flotilla would emerge and had positioned themselves to be the first thing human eyes saw. She turned to Captain Goss, who stood at the center of the TSN Blackthorn's bridge with his arms folded and his jaw set. Goss was career Navy, 42 years commanding warships, and he had the posture of a man who had learned to keep his body still while his mind ran scenarios at combat speed. His face gave nothing away. It never did. Sierra had served with him for 3 weeks during the transit, and in that time she had learned exactly 2 things about him. He did not trust civilians on his bridge, and he did not trust first contact specialists at all. "How many?" Goss asked. Harsk worked his board. The amber returns multiplied as the passive sensors completed their sweep. 19 vessels. No, 20. One just lit its drives behind a gas pocket. 20 confirmed. Formation is concentric 3 rings, innermost at 9,000 clicks, outermost at 14. They've got us bracketed, sir. Sierra studied the tactical plot as it populated. The Vithani ships were rendered in amber unknown class, unknown armament, unknown intent. 20 amber icons arranged in perfect geometric rings around the point where 3 Terran warships now sat, still bleeding off the residual energy of their hyperspace transit. The TSN Blackthorn, a Sabre-class gunship, lean and low-slung, and built for the kind of work that didn't make the official dispatches. Behind it, the destroyer escort TSN Halberd, broader in the beam and bristling with point defense clusters. And trailing both, the diplomatic courier TSN Canticle, which carried nothing heavier than a communications suite and the formal instruments of first contact. 3 ships, 20 unknowns, and Sierra Marin, the woman Terran command had sent to make sure this ended with a handshake instead of a salvo. "Weapons," Goss said. "Hot," his XO answered from the weapons console. Commander Tellez had already brought the point defense grid to standby without waiting for the order, which told Sierra everything she needed to know about how the bridge crew was reading the situation. She could hear the faint hydraulic moan of the turret housings cycling from stowed to ready deep in the ship's bones. Kinetic batteries charged, torpedo bays pressurized. "We can go loud in 4 seconds. "Hold," Goss said. Then quieter, in the tone of a man addressing someone he was not entirely sure he should be addressing. "Specialist Marin." Sierra stepped forward. This was the part they never showed in the recruitment hollows, the moment when the entire chain of command pivoted on a single person who held no line authority, commanded no weapons, and answered to an office 3 bureaucratic layers removed from the Navy. She was Terran Contact Division. Her rank was a polite fiction. Her authority was real only as long as the captain chose to listen to her, and captains stopped listening the moment shooting started. "The formation is ceremonial," she said. 3 concentric rings. In Vithani ritual architecture, that's a threshold greeting. It's how they receive a delegation they consider spiritually significant. If they meant to attack, the geometry would be different. Tighter, overlapping fields of fire. This is open, structured. "Deliberate." "You're reading their religious texts at a tactical display," Goss said. That's what you brought me for, Captain. What I brought you for is to tell me whether those ships are going to shoot at us. They're not yet, not unless we give them a reason. Goss held her gaze for 2 seconds, measuring her the way he would measure a subordinate reporting damage control status during a hull breach, searching for hesitation, uncertainty, any crack in the foundation. Then he nodded, a single tight motion. Comms, open a channel. Standard first contact protocol, wideband all frequencies. Let them hear us. The comms officer, a young woman named Patel who had never been in a first contact situation before and was managing to hide it behind a professional mask that was almost but not quite convincing, activated the array. Channel open, sir. Broadcasting universal greeting package. Translation matrix loaded. Silence. The bridge held its breath. Sierra watched the tactical plot and counted. The 20 Vethani ships held their positions with mechanical precision, not a single drive flare out of alignment. Whatever they were, they had discipline. That could be reassuring or terrifying depending on what happened in the next 3 minutes. Harsk broke the count first. No change in formation, no weapon signatures, no shield modulations, they're just sitting there. Waiting, Sierra said. They're waiting for us to speak first. In Vethani ceremonial protocol, the arriving party declares intent. The receiving party responds. If we don't speak, they'll interpret the silence as a refusal to engage, and that triggers a defensive reclassification. Meaning, Goss said. Meaning they stop treating us as guests and start treating us as intruders. The 20 ships close their rings, and the geometry goes from ceremonial to lethal. Goss's jaw tightened. We are speaking. Patel has the greeting running. The greeting package is a data stream. They want a voice, a presence, someone who claims authority to speak for the group. Response, Patel said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable before she caught it. Incoming transmission. Audio only, running through the translation matrix now. The bridge speakers hissed, popped, and then delivered a voice that sounded like stone grinding against glass-layered harmonics that the human ear could only partially process, as though the speaker was using frequencies reserved for a different kind of hearing. The translation matrix chewed on it for 4 agonizing seconds before rendering it into flat, affectless English. You have crossed the threshold. Identify your caste and present your ritual standing, or be consumed as offering. The temperature on the bridge dropped by 15 degrees. Sierra felt it in the way every officer's spine straightened simultaneously, in the way Tellys's hand drifted 3 centimeters closer to the weapon's release, in the way Goss's jaw muscles bunched hard enough to whiten the skin along his mandible. Consumed as offering, Goss repeated, the words coming out like a question that refused to be one. It's liturgical, Sierra said, keeping her voice level. She could feel the bridge crew's attention pressing against her like a physical weight, every officer waiting for the civilian specialist to explain why they shouldn't be reaching for the weapons panel. The Vethani social structure is theocratic. Every interaction is framed as a religious ceremony. Consumed as offering isn't a threat. It's a warning that if we don't identify ourselves within their caste framework, they'll classify us as sacrificial material. It's procedural. Procedural. Goss turned the word over like he was tasting something rotten. The procedural version of pointing 20 warships at my flotilla and threatening to eat us. The distinction matters, Captain. Does it? It does, if you want to leave this system without firing. Goss stared at her. Sierra held it. She had been doing this for 9 years, standing on bridges, reading alien body language from sensor data, translating threats that might be greetings and greetings that might be threats, and carrying the full weight of the gap between the two. She had been wrong once. 3 years ago, in the Kelly's Narrows, she had read a display formation as a welcome parade. It was an encirclement. The TSN Gareth lost 31 crew members in the 12 seconds between her misread and the captain's order to return fire. The scars on her left forearm, hidden beneath her uniform sleeve, mapped the cost of that error in the kind of detail no debriefing could capture. She would not be wrong today. She could not afford to be. "Respond," Goss said. "Specialist Marin has the con for communications. Weapons remain hot. Tellies, if those ships twitch, you don't wait for my order." Sierra moved to the comm station and composed the reply in her head before she spoke it. The Vethani used a caste system with 7 tiers, each defined by a sacred function. She had spent 4 months studying their intercepted transmissions, their art, their architecture, their funeral rites. She had decoded 3 of their philosophical texts and cross-referenced them with the structural patterns in their ship formations. She knew things about the Vethani that the Vethani might not know about themselves, because she had the advantage of distance, the ability to see patterns that those living inside the system couldn't. "Patel, transmit the following. Use the liturgical register the Matrix flagged in their greeting. Match their cadence exactly." Patel's fingers hovered over her console. "Ready." "We are the Terran delegation. We carry no caste, for we are from beyond the threshold. We present ourselves as the unplaced, those who seek audience with the voice of the conquered, to be given standing." Patel transmitted. The bridge waited. Sierra counted her own heartbeats. 7, 8, 9. At 12, Harsk shifted in his seat. At 15, Tellies' hand settled fully on the weapons panel. At 18, Goss drew a breath that was audible across the bridge. "Response incoming," Patel said. This time the translation came faster, the Matrix having calibrated to the Vethani vocal patterns. "The unplaced are acknowledged. Hold in the outer ring. A speaker will attend." The tension on the bridge eased by a fraction, the kind of fraction that meant nobody was reaching for the weapons release anymore, but nobody was sitting down either. Goss looked at Sierra with an expression she had seen before, grudging acknowledgement layered over deep unease. "What happens now?" he asked. "They send someone to evaluate us. A speaker, that's their diplomatic caste, 2nd tier. They'll assess whether we're worth talking to or worth recycling into raw materials for their temple ships." "You keep saying things like that as though they're reassuring." "They're not meant to be reassuring, Captain. They're meant to be accurate." Goss turned back to the viewport. Through the reinforced glass, the Vethani formation was visible as a pattern of distant lights, each one a ship whose capabilities they could only guess at. "How long do we wait?" "As long as they need. Impatience reads as aggression in their framework." Goss said nothing. He stood at the viewport like a monument to military patience, hands behind his back, weight forward on his toes, and waited. The speaker's vessel detached from the innermost ring 23 minutes later. It was smaller than the warships if they were warships, and moved with a fluid grace that suggested either exceptional engineering or something biological at work in its propulsion system. The hull was not metal. It was smooth and pale, ridged like bone, and as it closed, the distant Sierra could see the surface shifting, contracting and expanding in rhythmic pulses that looked disturbingly like breathing. Sierra watched its approach on the tactical display, and noted the way the other Vethani ships adjusted their formation to create a corridor for it, like a living system rearranging itself around a nerve impulse. "It's beautiful," Patel murmured, and then caught herself. Sierra didn't correct her. The girl wasn't wrong. "Biometric signatures," Harsk said. "I'm reading life signs aboard that vessel. One occupant, it's coming alone." "Bold," Goss said. "Faithful," Sierra corrected. "In their theology, a speaker carries the weight of the conquered's spiritual authority. One speaker is the conquered for purposes of negotiation. Sending more would dilute the sacred mandate." The speaker's vessel came to rest 300 meters off the Blackthorn's port bow, and for a long moment nothing happened. The bone-white hull pulsed in its slow respiratory rhythm. No transmissions, no hails, no movement. Then the comms array lit up with a data stream so dense it nearly overwhelmed the translation matrix. Patel's console erupted in cascading text, and for several seconds the young officer simply stared at the flood. "It's sending us everything," Patel said, scrolling through the cascade. "Linguistic databases, cultural protocols, ritual frameworks, musical theory, architectural principles, theological treatises. It's like they're handing us the operating manual for their entire civilization." Sierra leaned over Patel's shoulder and studied the data. She had been expecting something like this. The Vethani believed that knowledge was sacred, and that withholding it was an act of spiritual violence. To them, handing over their complete cultural framework wasn't generosity. It was the minimum standard of civilized behavior, the same way a human might shake hands upon meeting perfunctory, expected, the baseline of interaction. Which meant they expected the same in return, and the clock was running. "Captain," Sierra said, "I need to send them our cultural database, the full package, language, history, social structures, everything we'd share with a friendly power." Goss turned to face her. Behind him, Tellez shook his head slowly, the gesture of a man watching someone walk toward a cliff and being unable to stop them. "You want to hand a potential hostile the complete operating manual for Terran civilization," Goss said. "If we don't, we insult them at a level they consider equivalent to an act of war. The Vethani don't distinguish between cultural silence and aggression. To them, refusing to share knowledge is the same as pointing a weapon. We are pointing weapons at them. Which is why the cultural exchange matters. It contextualizes the weapons. It tells them we're armed but willing to talk. Without it, all they see is the guns." Goss worked his jaw. Sierra could see the calculation running behind his eyes, the career cost of sending classified cultural data to an unknown alien power versus the career cost of starting an interstellar war, because he was too cautious to follow his contact specialist's advice. It was the kind of calculation that could take hours in a committee room. He had about 90 seconds. "Stripped version," he said. "Nothing about fleet strength, nothing about Saul's defensive grid, nothing about weapons capabilities. Cultural data only. History, language, philosophy, art. Nothing they could use against us." "That's enough. Do it. And specialist, if this goes wrong, I will personally ensure your career ends before mine does." Sierra compiled the package herself, pulling from the diplomatic database aboard the Canticle. She included language, art, music, literature, social customs, religious history, philosophical traditions. She stripped the military data as Goss ordered but left in enough context to make the package feel complete: references to conflicts resolved, wars ended, treaties honored. The shape of a species that had learned violence and chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, to set it down when it could. The Vethani would know if they were being shortchanged. They had already demonstrated a level of cultural sophistication that suggested they could spot a curated dataset from a genuine one. She transmitted and waited. Response came in 12 minutes, which Sierra knew from her research was unusually fast. The Vethani operated on ritual timescales: hours for a simple acknowledgement, days for a formal decision. 12 minutes meant either extreme urgency or extreme satisfaction. The speaker's vessel flared its drives and repositioned itself directly ahead of the Blackthorn, nose to nose at 200 meters. At that range, the Blackthorn's forward guns could cut it in half before the crew finished drawing breath. "New transmission," Patel said. "The speaker wants to board us." The bridge went quiet in a way that suggested everyone had suddenly forgotten how to exhale. Tellez half rose from his chair. Harsk's hands froze on his sensor board. Even the hum of the environmental system seemed to pause, as though the ship itself was holding its breath. "Absolutely not," Tellez said from weapons. "Captain, we cannot allow an unknown alien entity aboard this vessel. We have no intelligence on their biology, their capabilities, or their—" Goss raised a hand, The single gesture cut Tellys off mid-sentence. Specialist. Sierra closed her eyes for 1 second. She saw the geometry of it, the ritual concentric formation, the knowledge exchange, the progressive closing of distance. Each step had brought the Vethani physically closer. 3 rings of ships, then the speaker crossing the gap, then the data exchange, then the repositioning to 200 meters. The Vethani were following a ceremony. Each step brought them physically closer because, in their theology, proximity was trust made manifest. Refusing the boarding request would be the same as slamming a door in the speaker's face at the moment they reached out to shake hands. And there would be no recovering from that. "We have to say yes," she said. "We have to do no such thing," Tellys said. "Commander Tellys," Sierra said, and turned to face him across the bridge. "If we refuse, the Vethani will interpret it as a declaration that we are spiritually hostile. Every ship in that formation will reclassify us from unplaced to offering. An offering, in case the liturgical framing wasn't clear enough, means exactly what it sounds like. So you say, based on 4 months of studying intercepted signals, that we can't independently verify. Based on 4 months of studying intercepted signals, 17 published xenological analyses, 3 decoded Vethani philosophical texts, and the fact that I have been doing this longer than you have been commanding a weapons console. I am telling you, with as much certainty as this field allows, that if we refuse, they will kill us." The bridge held its silence. Sierra and Telly stared at each other across 10 feet of military-grade tension, 2 professionals who understood the stakes completely and disagreed on the solution absolutely. Goss broke it. "The speaker comes aboard, full Marine escort. Specialist Marin handles all communication. Nobody speaks unless I authorize it. Nobody touches a weapon unless I give the word. Clear." The Marines assembled in the portside docking bay, 8 of them in light combat armor, weapons present but not raised. Sergeant Wren, the squad leader, positioned her people in a receiving formation that looked welcoming if you didn't notice the firing angles. Sierra positioned herself at the front, unarmed, wearing her contact division uniform with its gold shoulder bars that meant nothing to anyone except other contact specialists, and apparently alien theocratic emissaries who communicated in color. The airlock cycled. Sierra heard the atmospheric seal break, heard the pressure equalization hiss, heard the soft mechanical grind of the inner door retracting. The air that came through was warm and smelled of mineral dust, dry, ancient, like opening a vault that had been sealed for centuries. The speaker entered. It was tall, taller than Sierra had expected from the sensor data, nearly 3 meters, with a body that looked like it had been carved from pale volcanic stone. 4 arms, each ending in a hand with 7 fingers, each finger jointed in 3 places. No visible mouth. The face, if it was a face, was a smooth oval of gray-white material with 2 deep-set eyes that burned with a light that was either bioluminescence or something Sierra's training had no category for. It wore robes. Layers of them in colors that shifted as the fabric moved, cycling through the visible spectrum in patterns that Sierra realized were not decorative but linguistic. The robes were talking. The colors were words, and they were speaking faster than she could read. She had 14 seconds to figure out what they were saying before the silence became an insult. The dominant color was deep amber, shifting to copper at the edges. In the Vethani chromatic lexicon, as she had reconstructed it from the intercepted transmissions, amber meant formal acknowledgement. Copper meant conditional respect. Respect offered but not yet committed. The pattern was cyclical, repeating every 4 seconds, which indicated a statement rather than a question. The speaker was saying, "I see you. I reserve judgment." Sierra straightened her spine and spoke in the liturgical register. She had practiced alone in her quarters for 3 months, shaping the sounds as close to the Vethani phonemic structure as human vocal cords allowed. The words felt like gravel in her throat, angular and heavy, and she tasted copper where the harder consonants abraded her soft palate. I am the voice who steps forward. I carry the weight of my people's intention. I ask to be weighed. Behind her she heard one of the Marines inhale sharply. They had never heard a human speak Vethani before. Neither had Sira, not aloud, not to a living Vethani. The speaker's robe shifted. The amber deepened to burnt gold. The copper vanished, replaced by a thread of pale blue that Sira's research told her meant surprise, genuine, unguarded surprise. The blue thread thickened, branching through the gold like lightning frozen in fabric. Then the speaker's chest split open. The Marines raised their weapons. Wren barked a targeting command. Tellys's voice crackled over the comm from the bridge, demanding a status report. Goss barked an order to hold fire. Sira held up both hands, palms out, and said one word that had to cut through every instinct every armed person in the bay was feeling. Wait. The speaker's chest had opened along a vertical seam that ran from collarbone to navel, a controlled biological process that looked violent but produced no blood, no fluid, no sign of distress. The cavity inside pulsed with soft amber light. Nested in what looked like crystalline tissue, a lattice of geometric structures that might have been mineral or might have been organic or might have been something Sira had no word for, was a small object. A polyhedron, maybe 10 centimeters across, its surface covered in markings that shifted and reformed like living text. The speaker extended 2 of its 4 arms and lifted the polyhedron from its own chest. Then it held the object toward Sira at the full extension of its reach, 3 meters of alien anatomy offering up its interior to a stranger. The ambient temperature in the docking bay dropped. Sira felt the cold settle into her bones, felt the Marines behind her shifting their weight, felt Wren's finger settle against her trigger guard, felt the entire weight of what was happening compress itself into the space between her hands and the speaker's offering. She knew what this was. She had read about it in a decoded Vethani funerary text, the only such text ever recovered, fragments from a derelict found drifting in the Kolari expanse. A heartstone, the crystallized record of a Vethani's accumulated knowledge, memories, and spiritual standing. They were created at the moment of a Vethani's first sacred duty and carried inside the body until death. Offering one to a stranger was the highest act of trust in Vethani culture. It was also, in certain ritual contexts, a test. Because taking the heartstone meant accepting responsibility for everything it contained. Every memory, every obligation, every debt and covenant recorded in its crystalline structure. If the recipient proved unworthy, the offering became a condemnation, the theological equivalent of handing someone a loaded weapon and watching to see if they pointed it at you. Sira looked at the heartstone. She looked at the speaker's burning eyes. She looked at the Marines with their raised weapons and thought about the 20 warships outside, arranged in their sacred geometry, waiting to see what happened next. She had about 6 seconds before the pause became too long, and the speaker interpreted her hesitation as rejection. Sira reached into the breast pocket of her uniform and pulled out the only personal item she carried on deployment, a small leather-bound notebook, its pages filled with her handwriting. 9 years of contact missions, compressed into observations, mistakes, insights, corrections, and the names of 3 colleagues who had died because first contact went wrong. Lieutenant Faris Keene, who died in the Kelly's Narrows because Sira misread a formation. Specialist Devon Cho, who died on Vesa Station because the translation matrix failed and no one caught it. Commander Ann Reeves, who died on the boundary because she stepped forward when Sira hesitated. She held the notebook out to the speaker. The exchange was simultaneous. The speaker placed the heartstone in Sira's left hand as she placed the notebook in its lower right hand. The heartstone was warmer than she expected, almost fever-hot, and it hummed against her palm with a frequency she felt in her teeth, in her sinuses, in the deep architecture of her skull. The speaker's seven-fingered hand closed around the notebook with a precision that suggested it understood exactly what it was holding. The speaker's robes erupted into color. Every shade in the visible spectrum cycled through the fabric in a cascade that lasted almost 8 seconds before settling into a pattern Sira had never seen in any decoded text. New colors, new combinations, a sentence that didn't exist in her vocabulary because it hadn't existed anywhere until this moment. Then the speaker did something that made every Marine in the bay take a step backward. It knelt, all 3 meters of it, folding its 4-jointed legs beneath its body, lowering its featureless face to the level of Sira's chest. Its upper arms spread wide, palms up, fingers open. Its lower arms cradled the notebook against its torso with a tenderness that looked almost human. In Vethani body language, this was total spiritual submission. The speaker was declaring, with its body and its robes and its exposed heartstone cavity, that Sira's people were worthy of the Conquered's full engagement. "Status report," Goss said over the comm, his voice tight. "Positive, Captain," Sira said. "The speaker has accepted us. We're in." The 20 warships outside began to move. Captain Harsk's voice came through the bridge comm, tight and controlled. "The Vethani formation is breaking. Repeat, formation is breaking. All 20 vessels are repositioning." "Repositioning how?" "They're opening a corridor, a clear lane from our position to the center of the cluster. And Captain, I'm reading new contacts. Dozens of them, coming out of the gas clouds. Civilian-scale vessels, no weapon signatures. It looks like a reception." Sira heard this through the comm in her ear and felt the heartstone pulse in her hand. She understood now what she hadn't been able to translate in the speaker's robes. The unknown pattern hadn't been a word she was missing from her vocabulary. It was a word that hadn't existed until now. The speaker had created it in real time, a new entry in the Vethani chromatic lexicon, to describe the moment when a people from beyond the threshold proved themselves worthy of a name in the Conquered's sacred registry. The speaker spoke. The translation matrix in Sira's earpiece rendered it into English with a slight delay. "Your voice carried weight. Your offering carried truth. The Conquered will remember the shape of your people. Come, there are those who have waited to see whether you were real." Sira turned to Ren. The sergeant had lowered her weapon and was looking at Sira with the carefully neutral expression of someone who had just watched her commanding contact specialist trade personal journals with an alien's internal organs and was processing it at whatever speed her training allowed. "Tell the captain the speaker is going to escort us into the cluster. Full diplomatic protocol. Weapons stay hot but stay quiet." Ren keyed her comm and relayed the message. Goss's reply came back in 4 seconds. "Understood. Weapons remain at standby. Specialist Marin retains communications authority. All ships follow the Blackthorn. Halberd holds the rear. Nobody blinks." The flotilla moved. 3 Terran warships, led by the lean predatory hull of the Blackthorn, sliding through a corridor of Vethani vessels that parted before them with choreographed precision. The gas clouds thinned as they pushed deeper into the cluster, and the star density increased until the forward display looked like a field of burning wheat. The civilian vessels kept their distance, flanking the corridor at 2,000 kilometers, close enough to observe, far enough to stay clear of any weapons lock. Sira stood on the bridge with the Heartstone in her jacket pocket, and the speaker's presence on the Blackthorn's observation deck, where it had been escorted by 2 Marines who looked like they were guarding a particularly dangerous piece of modern art. She could feel the stone's warmth through the fabric, a constant low-grade reminder that she was carrying a piece of someone's soul against her hip. Patel was the first to see it. "Commander Marin," she said, and her voice had changed. The professional mask had cracked open, and something raw and involuntary had come through. "You need to see this." The forward display resolved the image as the Blackthorn cleared the last veil of gas. Ahead, filling the viewport from edge to edge, was a structure so large that the tactical computer initially classified it as a natural formation before Harsk overrode the designation manually. A station, a city, a cathedral built in space and scaled to hold a civilization inside it. The Vethani-conquered seat of government was a sphere 1,200 kilometers in diameter, its surface covered in spires and domes and archways that caught the light of the surrounding star cluster and refracted it into a permanent aurora. Smaller structures orbited it in concentric rings, the same three-ring geometry that the warship formation had used, scaled up by a factor of thousands. Ships moved between the rings like blood cells in a circulatory system, and the whole thing rotated with a slow, stately grace that suggested it had been spinning for longer than human civilization had existed. Goss stood at the viewport and said nothing for almost a full minute. Nobody spoke. The bridge was silent except for the hum of systems and the distant tick of Harsk's sensor feeds. "Specialist," Goss said finally, his voice stripped of its command cadence, "what am I looking at?" "The threshold seat. The Vethani-conquered's holy capital. There are maybe 6 non-Vethani species who have ever been invited to see it, according to what we've decoded. We just became the 7th. In how long? 12,000 years. Goss absorbed this. She watched him rebuild his composure brick by brick, watched the awe drain out of his expression and the military discipline fill it back in, and she respected him for it even as she noted how long it took. "And the warships are still tracking us?" "Yes." "And our weapons are still hot?" "Yes." "And you're comfortable with that arrangement?" Sierra considered the question. She thought about the heartstone in her pocket, the speaker kneeling in the docking bay, the corridor of ships opening before them like a throat. She thought about the 9 years of contact missions that had taught her one immutable lesson. Comfort was a luxury that contact specialists could not afford. What they could afford was accuracy. And her reading of this situation, the best reading she was capable of, was that the Vethani were doing exactly what their theology demanded, welcoming strangers into the sacred space, while maintaining the capacity to destroy them if the strangers proved unworthy. The Vethani weren't hostile, they were cautious. And their caution looked identical to aggression, because their entire civilization was built on the principle that the sacred and the lethal occupied the same space. "I'm not comfortable," she said. "I'm confident there's a difference." The Blackthorn docked at a port on the threshold seat's equatorial ring, guided in by automated beacons that locked onto the gunship's nav array, and threaded it through a gap in the station's defensive architecture that was barely wider than the ship's beam. The pilot, a woman named Vasquez who hadn't spoken since the transit alarm, landed the gunship with hands that didn't shake and a jaw that never unclenched. The delegation assembled in the docking bay. Sierra led, flanked by Goss on her right and the Canticle's diplomatic officer, a man named Iosif Brennan, on her left. Behind them, 8 Marines and 4 technical staff carrying recording equipment and cultural analysis hardware. The airlock opened onto a passageway carved from something that looked like living stone, its walls covered in the same shifting chromatic patterns that the speaker's robes had displayed. The colors moved in slow waves, and Sierra realized after several steps that the walls were not decorated, they were communicating. The entire structure was one vast linguistic system, and walking through it was like walking through the middle of a conversation that had been going on for millennia. Brennan touched the wall and pulled his hand back as if burned. "It's warm," he said, "and it's vibrating." "Don't touch anything else," Sierra said. The passageway opened into a chamber that defied easy description. It was vast kilometers across, Sierra estimated, though the curved geometry made precise measurement difficult. The ceiling was transparent, and through it, the star cluster blazed with enough intensity to turn the chamber into a cathedral of light. Tiers of seating rose in concentric circles around a central dais, and the tiers were filled. Thousands of Vethani, tens of thousands, all of them seated in absolute stillness, their robes cycling through synchronized color patterns that created a visual harmony so complex it bordered on music. The effect was overwhelming, like standing at the center of a living kaleidoscope that was also watching you with focused, unblinking attention, every eye burning with that same deep bioluminescence, every robe speaking a word in a language Sira could only partially read. Goss stopped walking. Sira heard his breath catch, heard the Marines behind her slow their pace, heard Brennan whisper something reverent under his breath. "Keep moving," Sira said. "They're waiting for us to reach the dais. Stopping is an insult." They walked. The distance felt enormous, though it couldn't have been more than 300 meters. Every step was observed by tens of thousands of luminous eyes, and the chromatic conversation on the walls intensified as they approached the center, the colors deepening and accelerating until the chamber felt like the inside of a heartbeat. The dais was elevated 3 meters above the chamber floor, reached by a ramp of the same living stone. At its center stood a figure that dwarfed even the speaker, a Vethani nearly 4 meters tall, with 6 arms instead of 4 and robes that blazed with a spectrum Sira's eyes couldn't fully process. The colors included frequencies that sat at the very edge of human visual perception, and looking at them too long made her temples ache. This was the voice of the conquered, the spiritual and political leader of the Vethani civilization, the equivalent of a supreme pontiff who also happened to command a navy. Sira climbed the ramp alone. This was not a decision she made, it was a recognition of what the ceremony demanded. The voice who steps forward alone. Goss stayed at the base, his hand resting on the sidearm he had been ordered not to draw. The Marines fanned out in a defensive semicircle that was probably useless against a species that could reclassify them as sacrificial offerings with a change of robe color. The voice spoke. The translation matrix strained to keep up with the harmonic layering. "You are the unplaced who sought standing. Your voice who steps forward has carried weight. You have given knowledge for knowledge, offered truth for truth. The conquered acknowledges the shape of your people." Sira bowed. "We are honored by the conquered's acknowledgement." But acknowledgement is not acceptance. The chamber's colors shifted. The synchronized patterns on thousands of Vethani robes broke into discordant fragments, like a choir suddenly singing different songs in different keys. The effect was jarring, physically disorienting, and Sira felt her balance waver before she locked her knees and forced her center of gravity down. Around her, the chamber pulsed with conflicting chromatic signals: doubt, suspicion, interest, hostility, curiosity, all layered on top of each other in a cacophony of color that made her head swim. "Your people carry weapons into the threshold," the voice said. "Your ships hold fire in their bellies. You offer knowledge with one hand and grip a blade with the other. This is a contradiction the conquered cannot reconcile." There it was, the fulcrum point, the moment when 9 years of training and instinct and accumulated scar tissue either proved their worth or didn't. Sira could feel Goss's tension from 3 meters below, could feel Telly's on the Blackthorn's bridge with his hand on the weapon's release, could feel the 20 warships outside recalculating their targeting solutions. She could feel the entire architecture of first contact bending around this single moment, this single question, this single answer that would determine whether humanity entered the galactic community as a welcomed guest or a consumed offering. She had about 10 seconds, maybe fewer. "The contradiction is the truth," Sira said. The voice's robes flickered. Uncertainty. The first uncertainty Sira had seen in any Vethani since the transit alarm screamed. "We carry weapons because we have learned that the universe does not reward the unarmed," Sira said. "We offer knowledge because we have learned that the universe does not forgive the silent. We are both of these things simultaneously, and we will not apologize for either, because to remove one would be to lie about what we are, and you have asked us for truth." Silence. Not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the loaded silence of a system recalculating, every Vethani in the chamber processing a statement that fit no existing category in their theological framework. The voice's 6 arms moved. 4 of them rose to a position Sira didn't recognize from any of the decoded texts, palms pressed together in pairs, forming 2 vertical planes on either side of the voice's torso. The remaining 2 arms extended towards Sira, palms up. New gesture, new meaning, being created in real time just as the speaker had created a new word in its robes. The conquered has a word for those who carry fire and water in the same vessel, the voice said. It is an old word, and it has not been spoken in 6,000 years, because no species has arrived at the threshold carrying both since the conquered's founding age. What word? Sira asked. Truth-bearers, those whose contradiction is their credential. The chromatic patterns in the chamber realigned. It happened in a wave, starting from the voice and radiating outward through the tears, every Vethani's robes shifting simultaneously to the same color. A deep, resonant gold that Sira's research told her was the highest possible marker of formal recognition. Not just acknowledgement, acceptance. The chamber became a single sustained note of gold, and the warmth of it was not just visual. Sira felt it on her skin, in her bones, in the heartstone pulsing against her hip. The conquered accepts the Terran delegation, the voice said. Your standing is granted. Your ships may hold their fire, and we will not ask you to set it down, for we understand now that the fire is part of the truth you carry. You are the 7th species to be given standing in 12,000 years, and the first to be named truth-bearers. Over the next 4 hours, the delegation moved through a series of formal ceremonies that Sira translated in real time, her voice growing hoarse from the effort of shaping Vethani phonemes with a human throat. The ceremonies were complex, layered, and laden with theological significance that would take xenologists years to fully unpack. But the essential message was simple. The Vethani conquered recognized the Terran delegation as a legitimate civilization, withstanding in the sacred hierarchy of the threshold. There were complications. There were always complications. The first came when a Vethani elder from the Assembly of Recorders, the conquered's historical and archival caste, approached Sira during a transition between ceremonies and presented her with a tablet of crystalline material covered in chromatic text. This is the conquered's formal record of today's events, the elder said through the translation matrix. We ask that you verify it against your own account before it is sealed in the archive. Sira read the record. It was accurate in every factual detail and wrong in every interpretive one. The Vethani had recorded the weapons exchange, the moment when the Blackthorn's guns went hot, as an act of spiritual assertion rather than military caution. They had interpreted the Marine escort as a ceremonial honor guard rather than a security detail. They had classified Sira's notebook not as a personal item, but as a sacred text, a Hearthstone equivalent created by a species too young to have developed crystalline memory technology. Every misinterpretation was flattering. Every misinterpretation was also dangerous, because it created a record of events that didn't match reality, and any future interaction based on that record would be built on a foundation of beautiful lies. Sira looked at the elder. She looked at the record. She looked at Goss, who was watching her from across the chamber floor with an expression that said he knew something was wrong but not what. She thought about what the voice had called them truth-bearers, and she made a decision that would complicate Terran-Vethani relations for the next 50 years, but would prevent them from collapsing in the next 5. The record is inaccurate, she said. The elder's robes went white, pure, unmodulated white, which Sira's research had never documented because it had never appeared in any intercepted transmission. Our weapons were not a spiritual assertion. They were a precaution against the possibility that you might try to destroy us. Our Marines were not an honor guard. They were combat troops prepared to fight and kill if necessary. And my notebook is not a sacred text. It's a personal journal containing the names of people who died, because I made mistakes. The chamber fell silent. The synchronized chromatic patterns across tens of thousands of robes stuttered, fragmented, and died. For 3 full seconds, the Vethani assembly was a field of white, every individual, every robe, every surface in the chamber drained of color. 3 seconds of absolute chromatic silence in a civilization that communicated through color. 3 seconds that felt longer than the entire transit. Then the voice spoke from the dais, and its tone was different from before. Lower, heavier, stripped of ceremony. You correct the record at the cost of the conquered's interpretation. You choose accuracy over flattery. This is unprecedented. This is what truth-bearers do, Sira said. You named us. This is what the name means. The white held for another 2 seconds. Then, starting from the voice and radiating outward through the assembly in a wave that took nearly 10 seconds to reach the outermost tier, the robes shifted to gold again. But a different gold, darker, richer, with threads of deep red that Sira's research associated with the Vethani concept of earned respect, as distinct from ceremonial respect. The difference mattered. Ceremonial respect could be withdrawn. Earned respect could not. The elder rewrote the record. The new version was accurate. It documented the weapons, the Marines, the notebook, and the precautionary nature of every military action the Terran flotilla had taken. It also documented Sira's correction, which the Vethani apparently considered significant enough to warrant its own archival entry. The second complication came 3 hours into the formal ceremonies, when a Vethani warship commander, identified by robes that included metallic threading in patterns associated with the conquered 7th caste, the Guardians approached Captain Goss directly and spoke without waiting for translation. The translation matrix caught up a moment later. Your ships, they are armed beyond what your defensive posture requires. The vessel you call Blackthorn carries weapons designed for offensive engagement against hardened targets. This is not the armament of a species seeking peace. Goss looked at Sira. Sira looked at the Guardian commander. The chamber was watching 60,000 Vethani, their robes flickering with the rapid amber-copper patterns of active assessment. Captain, Sira said, quietly enough that only Goss and the Guardian could hear, answer honestly. The Vethani have already accepted the contradiction. Trying to minimize the Blackthorn's capabilities will undermine everything we've built in the last 6 hours. Goss straightened. He was a warship captain, and this was a question about warships, and for the first time since the transit alarm had screamed, he was on ground he understood completely. The Blackthorn is a Sabre-class gunship, Goss said. She carries 6 forward kinetic batteries, 2 torpedo bays, a full point defense grid, and enough ordnance to reduce a medium-sized moon to gravel. She is designed for offensive engagement, because the universe we come from taught us that the best way to avoid a fight is to make sure everyone knows you can finish one. The Guardian's robes shifted through a rapid sequence: amber, copper, red, blue, and then a color Sira had never seen, a deep violet black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The Guardian held that color for 4 seconds, long enough for Sira to feel the absence of light like a physical chill. This is truth, the Guardian said. This is truth, Goss confirmed. The Guardian turned and walked back to its position in the assembly without another word. Its robes settled into gold. The delegation returned to the Blackthorn at the 9-hour mark. The airlock closed behind them, and the familiar smell of recycled air and gun oil settled over Sira like a blanket. She leaned against the corridor wall outside the docking bay and closed her eyes for 3 seconds, the first 3 seconds in 9 hours when nobody was watching her, weighing her words, or waiting for her to decode the emotional state of an alien civilization. She was tired in a way that went deeper than fatigue. She was tired in the way that people who make decisions under pressure are tired the specific exhaustion that comes from holding multiple possible futures in your head simultaneously, knowing that the wrong word could collapse all of them into the one you feared most. Goss found her there. Specialist. She opened her eyes. Captain, Command is going to want a full debrief. The Diplomatic Corps is going to want a full debrief. Terran Contact Division is going to want a full debrief. And the Intelligence Bureau is going to want to know exactly how much of our cultural database I authorized you to transmit. I know. You made decisions today that were outside your authority. Yes. You countermanded my weapons officer. You committed us to a knowledge exchange without full authorization. You corrected the Vethani's own historical record in front of their entire ruling assembly, which could have collapsed the entire negotiation. Yes. You traded your personal journal for an alien organ. Yes. Goss studied her. Behind his eyes, she could see the career officer's mind running the audit, cataloging every protocol violation, every chain of command breach, every moment when a civilian specialist had overridden military judgment in a first contact scenario with 20 warships aimed at his hull. And every one of those decisions was correct. Sierra said nothing. There was nothing to say. She had done the job. The job was done. The names in her notebook, Keene, Cho, Reeves, would not be joined by new ones today. The after-action report, Goss said, is going to classify this mission as a peaceful first contact. That's what goes in the official record. That's what command will read. That's what will go into the briefing materials for the next diplomatic mission. Sierra thought about the 20 warships that had bracketed them on arrival, targeting solutions running before the first word was spoken. She thought about the weapons that had stayed hot for 9 hours straight, torpedo bays pressurized, point defense grid cycling, kinetic batteries charged and aimed. She thought about the Marines with their raised rifles in the docking bay, and Wren's finger on the trigger guard, and Telly's half standing from his chair when the speaker's chest split open. She thought about the speaker offering her its soul, and the 6 seconds she'd had to decide whether to accept it. She thought about the voice calling them truth-bearers, and the 3 seconds of white silence when she'd told the assembly the truth about why humanity carried weapons into temples. She thought about the Guardian commander looking at Goss and recognizing, in the captain's honest accounting of his ship's killing power, something worthy of respect. Peaceful, that was the word command would use. It was the word the record would carry. It was technically accurate in the narrowest possible sense. No shots had been fired, no casualties had been sustained, no vessels had been damaged, no one had died. But Sierra knew what it had actually been. She had stood at the exact center of the gap between peace and war for 9 hours, and she had held the gap open with nothing but her voice and her judgment, and the names of 3 dead colleagues. And the gap had been so narrow that a single mistranslated syllable could have closed it. Peaceful, she said. Goss nodded. Peaceful, he paused. Thank you, Specialist Marin. He walked away down the corridor. Sierra stayed against the wall, feeling the Hearthstone's warmth through her jacket pocket, listening to the distant hum of engines that had never powered down, and weapons that had never stood at ease. The record would say peaceful. She would remember what it cost.